So welcome to Rumination, the podcast that offers practical solutions to the challenges in our industry. Hi, I'm Chris Gwynn, your host. And today I'm talking with Dr. Juan de Dios Garza, who is a feedlot specialist based in Mexico. And he will be talking to us today about feedlot cattle stressors. Dr. Garza has over 40 years of experience in nutrition and management consulting in the beef industry. He completed his MSc at Iowa State University and his PhD at Oklahoma State. During his 40 years career, he has influenced current nutritionists throughout Mexico, having worked as a guest lecturer and a lecturer at various universities throughout Mexico. During this career, he has worked closely with many of the top beef producers in Mexico, including many of the feed companies that supply nutrients to the feedlot industry. Dr. Garza focuses his knowledge and experience consulting to improve management and nutritional practices that impact beef producers' profitability. Welcome to Rumination, Dr. Garza, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Hey, you're welcome, and again, thanks for your time today. Dr. Garza, you recently presented at the annual Jeffo Beef Academy on how to manage the impact of stressors, in particular on dry matter intake in feedlot cattle. Would you give our audience an overview of the key stressors and how they impact dry matter intake in feedlot cattle?
Well, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to share this talk with you. First, I want to say that any stimulus that produces stress is defined as a stressor. Normally, a stressor triggers a stress response in the body, which causes a physiological change. And in this case, feed intake is the physiological response. So there are multiple stressors that affect feed intake in cattle, but we must differentiate how they affect in the long term or in a short term. The long-term factors are related to the animal characteristics like sex, age, frame size, initial body weight, final body weight, average daily gain, and energy concentration of the diet. These factors, long-term factors, are very important because they at the end of the feeding period they determine the response of the stress in the animal. But the short-term factors that influence feed intake are the ones that occurs daily on a daily variations and are related basically to feed management and weather. These factors are the ones that we must deal with daily and are the ones that we must be attended. Some examples of these stressors are heat or cold weather, barometric pressure, humidity, changes in formulation, for instance, feeding schedule, feeding characteristics or characteristics of the ingredients, such as protein content or natural detergent fiber percentage of the diet, the fat content, and the animal comfort like pen space, shades, bunk space, and water trough spaces. All of these stressors are the ones that we have to take care every day on a daily basis.
And just on that, what kind of performance differences have you seen in the past from a farm that does a really, really good job in managing these stressors and a farm that lets many of them go by? Can you quantify that a bit in percentage daily gain or feed efficiency?
Well, yeah, there are several. Like for instance, if we can increase feed intake 2%, we probably will increase performance around 4%. And that, if we calculate the numbers as an economical, we're talking about $9 more. So it's very important to put attention in feed intake, because every stressor that affects feed intakes affect performance. And if performance is not, attended, we lose a lot of money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Big return. So a big reason to be spending time to, as you pointed out, all the different management things that we can do in nutritional to minimize those negative impacts of stress. And so on that, maybe we can step back and remind the audience about some of those management recommendations. You talked about cold and hot weather stress, feed deliveries, etc. What other perhaps nutritional changes? What do you typically recommend your producers you're dealing with as general practices on dealing with or minimizing stressors in feedlot cattle?
Well, first we must identify what are the stressors that are affecting the feed intake. And I'm talking about feed intake because feed intake is closely related to performance. And if we measure performance, it cannot be measured on a daily basis. So feed intake can be measured on a daily basis. And so if we relate feed intake to performance or to the expected performance, that will make much more sense. So we need to, for example, if the problem is a problem of a pen size, if we have a crowded pen, well, of course we need to tackle that. Or if the problem is a shade space, we have to give the adequate space to the animal. Or if the problem is bunk space, we have to tell the producer that the pen has a lot of animals, so we have to take out some animals from that and give the adequate space and reduce the stress. But if the stressor is heat stress, then we check basic points like management. Animal comfort is very important, and so we know that if we don't have the right spaces for the animals and the shades and the water troughs and the water bunk spaces, we need to do a lot of management, and we have to take care of that primarily. But there are all the things that we have to look at, like the characteristics of the diets, the type of diet that we have normally in a feed yard is really high in corn, and it has a lot of fermentable carbohydrates. So in a heat stress animal, fermentable carbohydrates produce a lot of heat internally, and that's one of the main problems. The animal has a lot of heat inside, and you have to get rid of it. So sometimes one of the management that we made is to give some animal fat and reduce the quantity or the percentage of grain in the diet. And also, very important, very, very, very important, we check feeding schedules. One of the major problems in the feedlots, at least here in Mexico, is that the feeding schedule doesn't feed normally, So other thing that we recommend is that the animals or the ration has to be served 35% in the morning, and 65% will be offered in the afternoon. That is because, in the afternoon we have less heat, and so the animal is dealing with the internal heat, and if we give a lot of fermentable carbohydrates during the morning, so we will have a big problem there. Yeah. So it's very important to observe a 6 hours period between feedings also. This is a very, very important thing, because that avoids variations in the servings. Yep. And the consistency is very, very important. If the stressor is a change in barometric pressure, then we must be prepared for changes in feed intake. Before the water front comes, the animals start eating a lot. And then After that, animals stop eating, and that fermented grain in the rumen may produce acidosis. So, under these conditions, it is recommended to change the ration to one with more raw fish and above the high energy diet to causes digestive upsets.
So a lot going on that you need to be prepared for. And could you dive down a little deeper into some of the nutritional modifications that you might make during these stress periods? From an ingredient perspective, you talked about switching to less fermentable, but are there other nutrients that you would rely upon?
Well, yes, there are several nutrition managements and tools to mitigate stress in the animals. Of course, the diet characteristics, as I mentioned previously, neutral detergent fiber percentage is very important, because if the diet has a high percentage of neutral detergent fiber has to be or is related to feed intake. The more neutral detergent fiber in the diet, the more effect in distension of the rumen. So rate of digestion is going to be low, and rate of digestion, if it's low, probably rate of passage is low too, and so feed intake goes down.
Yep.
So that's very important to see the dietary characteristics, because for instance, a diet that it doesn't have enough protein, or it has a lot of carbohydrates, fermented carbohydrates, we can replace those fermented carbohydrates in certain percentage with fat. But we don't have to deal only with the characteristics of the diet. Also, we have to deal with bone management,
yep.
Feeding schedules, as I mentioned previously, consistency of servings. So we have to avoid daily variations. But another very, very important thing that we have on hand is the feed additives. And feed additives are good examples, of course. These feed additives, none of them is a magic bullet, but they help to cope. They help to cope with problems. I will mention some of the additives that I will say that we use pretty often to mitigate feed intake, like potassium, like salt, like fat, like ionophores, like protected B vitamins, niacin, biotin, betaine, prebiotics and probiotics, antibiotics, yeast, essential oils, and lately chromium and zinc combination will also seems to help a lot.
So these are,
for instance, monensin is one additive that helps to control frequency of feeding, and this is a really good tool because animals on monensin have a small meals during the day, so they go to the trough more frequently with less feed in every feeding time that they go to the trough. So that will help a lot to prevent acidosis.
Yep.
I've done a lot I've been involved in several research and several trials, and I've been testing, like for instance, yeast. And I've seen that yeast helps to maintain feed intake during heat stress and modify fiber digestion and consequently ruminal pH. And lately we have found as a nutritionist that not only the rumen is the problem, but also the intestine. So these additives, some of them influence intestinal permeability and immune system response. Like for instance, protected B vitamins in the oxidative process that occur during stress and maintain feed intake in newly received calves. I've done several trials, but only one trial in the northern part of Mexico with B vitamins in the receiving, And really, it produced a little bit more average daily gain. They maintained the animals maintained the consumption, and they didn't have problems with the health problems, and I think that also B vitamins, protected B vitamins, might help in maintaining the integrity of the lower gut as well. But I haven't tested that. But I suppose that this will be also
an area of interest.
An area of interest to look at. Another type of additive like essential oils and chromium zinc may help also to keeping integrity of the small intestine epithelium and probably stimulating some immunological responses of the stress animals. These two additives, we've been using in the last 3-4 years, and we have seen very nice response in the animals.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of discussion about the impact of the lower gut on obviously immunity and health and the energy cost to immune function, et cetera. So it's a fascinating area. And I know some of the farms you work have absolutely exceptional research capabilities. So I appreciate you enlightening the audience on some of the micronutrients that you've utilized to help your cattle get through some of those stress periods. So thank you for that. So for our audience, as we wrap up, for our audience listening in today, what would be some of the key take-home points that you would remind them and recommend them to focus on to manage their cattle through periods of stress?
Well, first we must accept and recognize that there are multiple stressors that affect animal performance. So there are many different stressors that affect animal performance. As I mentioned previously, animal performance cannot be monitored daily. So one of the major important tools that we have is feed intake. So if we measure feed intake on a daily basis and measure it correctly and try to tie it up with performance, and I would say to expected performance, then we have a very important tool to predict what is going to happen with the animal. So any stressor that affects feed intake will compromise performance. And why is important to tie up performance with intake? Because about 70% of the reproductive responses in feedlot animal is explained by feed intake. So once we identify the problem, we must implement the correct management to deal with this stress. As I mentioned previously, we put a lot of attention in the animal comfort, and the space, water space, availability of water, trough or the bunk space, the diet characteristics, and things that we can really measure or take a look ahead of time are very, very, very important. Do not forget that there are so many tools like feed additives that help reducing the impact on stress. Many people think that we use feed additives only for just to increase performance, but sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes we use some of the feed additives, like for instance, yeast or B vitamins. In heat stress problems, sometimes we are not looking for a good performance, but at least to have the additive to cope with the problems that heat stress can produce. So those additives at least can help to mitigate the problem or to reduce the problem. And also, we have to remember that we must plan ahead the problem. So like, for instance, when we have a weather front, we already know that we are going to have problems. So
Absolutely.
we have to implement some changes right away. In the northern part of Mexico, in which we have very large feed yards, the things that we know in the summertime is just to have a very, very comfortable animal, not to put too many animals in the pen, give them probably a little bit more space in everything, in water trough, in bunk, and shade the space, because that helps a lot. And also to observe the serving times, and as I told you before, it is very important to serve the meals or the feed, let's say at 6 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning, and 6 hours later serve the second. And try to be really consistent with that, because that and bunk management can help us a lot to reduce digestive upsets. And so by doing that, if we plan ahead of time, in some cases we can anticipate implementing these changes and do not wait until the problem is there.
Yeah, no, fascinating sharing these points and reminders, your 40 years of experience. So with that in mind, I want to thank you very much for sharing with our rumination audience today your insights into managing these stressors in feedlot cattle. Thank you very much, Dr. Garza.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your invitation, and sorry for my Spanglish.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you very much again. And I surely want to thank our audience for listening to us, so that you don't miss our next episode on Rumination Podcast. You can find us at jeffo.ca, or find us also at Apple and Google Podcasts and Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jeffo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world.